3 years ago, I purchased my dream home in Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood seemed perfect in every way: tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a sense of pride that radiated from every property. I fell in love with the colonial-style house with its white siding, black shutters, and spacious yard that wrapped around the corner lot. The previous owners had neglected the landscaping, but I saw that as an opportunity rather than a drawback. This would be my sanctuary, my little piece of suburban paradise. I spent every weekend that first spring working on my lawn and garden. The grass received premium seed treatment, careful watering schedules, and meticulous mowing patterns. I planted rose bushes along the front walkway and installed a small stone garden near the mailbox. My neighbors would often stop and compliment my dedication. Even Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, told me she had never seen the property look so beautiful. When I received my welcome packet from the Homeowners Association, I read through the rules carefully. Some seemed strict: specific paint colors for front doors, limitations on holiday decorations, and regulations about trash can placement. But overall, they appeared reasonable and designed to maintain the character of the neighborhood. I attended my first HOA meeting, eager to meet my neighbors and become part of the community. That was when I first encountered Karen Thompson. She sat at the head of the table in the community center, a stack of papers organized neatly before her. Her blonde hair was cut in that distinctive sharp bob that seemed to accentuate the permanent downward curve of her mouth. As HOA president, she conducted the meeting with rigid efficiency, frequently referencing bylaws and previous violations. Her house, I later learned, was at the far end of the neighborhood, a large two-story with pristine landscaping and not a blade of grass out of place. The trouble began subtly. One morning, I noticed tire tracks cutting across the corner of my lawn where it curved around at the intersection. The tracks were shallow but distinct. Someone had driven over the grass rather than following the proper turn around the corner. I assumed it was probably neighborhood teenagers taking a shortcut, or perhaps a delivery driver in a hurry. I raked over the tracks, reseeded the area, and thought little more about it. 3 days later, the tracks reappeared in the same location. This time, they were deeper, creating small ruts in the soil. I became concerned and decided to install a simple security camera aimed at that corner of my property. The camera was discreet, mounted under the eaves of my garage with a clear view of the problem area. I did not expect what the footage would reveal. At precisely 7:45 the next morning, a white Lexus SUV came to the intersection but did not follow the curve of the road. Instead, it deliberately veered right onto my property, cutting directly across the corner of my lawn before rejoining the road on the other side. The maneuver saved perhaps 15 seconds of driving time. I zoomed in on the footage and felt my stomach drop. Behind the wheel, completely unmistakable, was Karen Thompson, president of the HOA. I reviewed footage from previous days and discovered this was not an isolated incident. Karen had been using my lawn as her personal shortcut every weekday morning for what appeared to be weeks. Each time, she would approach the corner, check for any observers, then cut across my property. The realization struck me like a physical blow. The woman who had recently cited the Andersons for having their garbage cans visible from the street was casually destroying my property on a daily basis. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the footage playing on repeat on my laptop screen. The contrast was staggering. Karen publicly portrayed herself as the neighborhood defender while privately showing complete disregard for another member's property. My initial confusion gave way to anger as I watched the white SUV carve its path across my carefully tended grass again and again. Something needed to be done, but I wanted to handle this properly. Surely a reasonable conversation would resolve the issue. The following Saturday morning, I stood on Karen's front porch with printed photos of the tire tracks and several screenshots from the security footage. I had rehearsed my approach carefully, determined to remain calm and professional. Karen answered her door wearing gardening gloves, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to recognition when she saw me. I introduced myself politely, reminding her that we had met at several HOA meetings. "I am sorry to bother you on a weekend," I began, "but I wanted to discuss a concerning issue regarding my property." I showed her the photographs, explaining how someone had been driving across my lawn regularly and causing damage. I deliberately avoided accusing her directly, giving her the opportunity to acknowledge her actions and apologize. Karen examined the photos with a disinterested expression. "These could be from anyone," she said dismissively. "Do you have actual proof of who did this?" I hesitated, then pulled out my phone and played the security footage. The video clearly showed her SUV cutting across my lawn. Karen watched without changing her expression, then handed my phone back with a shrug. "I am just saving time," she said. "That corner is ridiculous. The developers should have made the turn less sharp. It takes an extra minute to drive around it properly." I was stunned by her casual admission and lack of remorse. "But it is my property," I explained. "The grass is being damaged, and I have spent considerable time maintaining it." Karen folded her arms across her chest. "Look," she said, her tone becoming condescending, "you are new here. There are certain understandings in this neighborhood. That corner has always been a problem. The previous owners never made a fuss about it." I attempted to redirect the conversation. "I understand the turn is inconvenient, but from what I can tell, the time saved is only about 15 seconds. Perhaps we could discuss this at the next HOA meeting and see if there is interest in petitioning the city for road improvements." 15 seconds twice a day adds up," Karen replied, checking her watch as if to emphasize the value of her time. "And speaking of HOA matters, I have been meaning to talk to you about your hedges. They are approaching the maximum allowed height. You might want to trim those before someone files a complaint." The threat was thinly veiled. I recognized the power dynamic she was establishing. She was the HOA president with the authority to make my life difficult if I pushed back on her behavior. Still, I maintained my composure. "I will check the height restrictions and address that right away," I assured her. "But regarding my lawn, I must respectfully ask that you stop driving across it. It is causing real damage that requires time and money to repair." Karen's smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course, I had no idea it was such a sensitive issue for you. Most neighbors here are more community-minded." She began closing her door. "I will try to remember in the future." That "try to remember" told me everything I needed to know about her intentions. The conversation had accomplished nothing. The next day, I sent a formal email to Karen with copies to the entire HOA board. The message was polite but firm, documenting the damage to my property and requesting that all residents respect property boundaries by remaining on designated roadways. I attached the photographic evidence but refrained from singling out Karen by name, hoping that the professional approach would resolve the situation. 3 days passed with no response from Karen or the board. Meanwhile, the tire tracks continued to appear each morning. I decided more direct action was needed. After consulting the HOA rulebook, I found that decorative borders and small fencing under 3 feet tall were permitted without pre-approval. I purchased several sections of white picket fence, the kind that pushed into the ground and created a charming border, and installed them along the vulnerable corner of my property. The fence matched my home's aesthetic perfectly and complied with all HOA regulations. It was a modest but clear physical boundary that I hoped would deter the unwelcome shortcut. I even planted several flowering shrubs between the fence sections to enhance the appearance. The installation took most of a Sunday, but by evening, I felt satisfied with both the look and the protection it offered my lawn. Monday morning, I left for work early, curious to see how Karen would respond to the new obstacle. When I returned home that evening, my heart sank at the sight that greeted me. The white picket fence lay in pieces, several sections completely destroyed and others knocked askew. Tire tracks cut a familiar path through the damaged barrier and across my lawn, deeper than ever before. One of the newly planted shrubs had been completely flattened. This time, there was no question of accident or misunderstanding. The destruction was deliberate and malicious. My security camera had captured the entire incident, Karen's SUV slowing as it approached the fence, then accelerating directly through it without hesitation. The message was clear. She would not be deterred by such obstacles. As I gathered the splintered pieces of fence from my lawn, I realized this conflict had escalated beyond what reasonable conversation could resolve. Karen had deliberately destroyed my property in an act of petty defiance. If she wanted a battle of wills, she had just ensured she would get one. The morning after Karen destroyed my fence, I began implementing a more comprehensive strategy. This was no longer about protecting my lawn. It had become a matter of principle. I cleared out my home office's bulletin board and created what my military father would have called an operations center. On the left side, I pinned a calendar marking each day Karen drove across my lawn. In the center, I placed a property survey map highlighting the disputed corner. On the right, I organized printed screenshots from the security footage, meticulously labeled with dates and times. I purchased a higher quality security camera with better resolution and night vision capabilities, installing it with a wider field of view. I also set up a motion-activated camera at a different angle to ensure complete coverage. Each incident would be documented from multiple perspectives, leaving no room for denial or misdirection. Every morning, I would check the footage before leaving for work, adding new evidence to my growing collection. Karen maintained her routine, seemingly emboldened by her destruction of the fence. On several occasions, she would slow down near my property line, as if making sure I was watching, before deliberately driving across my lawn. The damage was becoming more visible, with distinct ruts forming where her tires repeatedly traversed the same path. I decided to reach out to other members of the HOA board individually, hoping to find allies. My first conversation was with Michael Brennan, the board treasurer. We met for coffee at a local cafe, carefully chosen to be outside the neighborhood to avoid Karen's notice. Michael listened attentively as I explained the situation, nodding sympathetically. "I am not surprised," he admitted, lowering his voice despite the privacy of our location. "Karen has been on the board for 5 years and president for 3. She runs this neighborhood like her personal kingdom." "Has no one ever challenged her?" I asked. Michael stirred his coffee slowly. "A few have tried. The Petersons questioned her selective enforcement of the holiday decoration policy last year. Within 2 months, they had received violation notices for everything from improper mulch color to unauthorized bird feeders." "That sounds like retaliation," I observed. "Of course it was," Michael agreed. "But everything was technically within the HOA guidelines. Karen knows the rule book better than anyone, and she uses it as a weapon against those who cross her." Similar conversations with other board members revealed a consistent pattern. Karen had cultivated a climate of fear through selective enforcement and petty retaliation. Most board members were too intimidated to oppose her publicly, though several expressed private support for my position. My suspicions were confirmed 3 days later when I received my first official HOA violation notice. The letter, bearing Karen's signature, cited peeling paint on exterior window trim and demanded correction within 14 days to avoid fines. I inspected the cited area with a magnifying glass and found a barely visible chip smaller than my fingernail. The following week brought another notice, this time for grass exceeding the maximum allowed height by a quarter-inch. These petty citations continued at a rate of approximately one per week. I addressed each violation immediately while documenting everything in my growing case file. I also noticed Karen or members of the inspection committee driving past my house with unusual frequency, clearly looking for any possible infraction. During this time, I began making connections with other neighbors who harbored similar grievances against Karen's reign. We would meet casually, often while walking dogs or checking mail, exchanging stories in hushed tones. The Wilsons had been cited for their children's basketball hoop being visible from the street. The Garcias had received multiple warnings about excessive gatherings when their extended family visited on Sundays. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 70s, had been reduced to tears when Karen personally measured her grass and issued a violation the day after Mrs. Henderson returned from her sister's funeral. These neighbors shared their stories freely but shrank back when I suggested collective action. "We cannot risk it," Mr. Garcia explained. "My wife works from home, and we cannot afford the fines if Karen decides to target us." This sentiment was echoed by nearly everyone I spoke with. Years of intimidation had created a neighborhood unwilling to stand against its tyrant. I would need to fight this battle alone, at least for now. I consulted with Robert Chen, a real estate attorney recommended by a colleague. After reviewing my documentation and hearing the full story, he leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time during our meeting. "You have done an excellent job documenting everything," he said, gesturing to the organized folder I had brought. "The good news is that you are completely within your rights to protect your property from trespass and damage. The HOA has no authority to grant easements or permission for one resident to damage another's property." "So what are my options?" I asked. "You could file for a restraining order," he suggested, "but that might be excessive at this stage. You could also send a formal cease and desist letter, which I would be happy to draft for you. However," he paused, his expression thoughtful, "there are other approaches that might be more effective and less confrontational." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. "The HOA has regulations about what modifications you can make to your property, correct?" When I nodded, he continued, "But they cannot prevent you from making improvements that comply with those regulations. Your property, your rights, as long as you stay within the guidelines." That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would continue to grow over the following days. As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. If direct confrontation would not work, perhaps creative compliance would. I spent that evening reviewing the HOA handbook page by page, paying special attention to landscaping guidelines and property modifications. There had to be a solution hidden somewhere within those rules, a way to protect my property while remaining entirely compliant with even the strictest interpretation of HOA regulations. I fell asleep that night with the handbook open on my chest, dreams filled with property lines and defensive strategies. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was determined to win this war not through direct conflict, but through something far more satisfying: malicious compliance on a scale Karen could never anticipate. Inspiration struck at 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday. I had fallen asleep on the couch watching a History Channel documentary about medieval castle defenses. I woke to images of a moat surrounding a European fortress, the narrator explaining how these water-filled trenches had been the primary defensive feature against invasion for centuries. In my half-awake state, the parallel seemed obvious and perfect. What if I could create a modern, suburban version of a moat, one that would be impossible to drive across, yet fully compliant with HOA regulations? I spent the remainder of the night researching landscape design, particularly water features and drainage solutions. By morning, my idea had evolved from a vague concept to a concrete possibility. The HOA rules permitted decorative water features and naturalistic landscaping elements with proper approval. Section 7.3 specifically encouraged environmentally conscious drainage solutions and rain gardens as part of the neighborhood's green initiative. With growing excitement, I expanded my research to include dry creek beds, rain gardens, and bioswales, all landscaping features that mimicked natural water drainage systems while providing aesthetic value. These designs typically included a depression in the ground, lined with rocks and water-tolerant plants. During rain, they would collect and filter water, preventing runoff. When dry, they remained attractive landscape features. Most importantly, they were impossible to drive across without damaging a vehicle. I sketched preliminary designs, positioning my decorative drainage feature precisely where Karen regularly cut across my lawn. The depression would be significant enough to deter vehicles, but gradual enough to appear completely natural and aesthetically pleasing. Native plants and decorative rocks would complete the installation, making it both functional and attractive. My first consultation with a professional landscaper did not go as planned. Jeff from Greenway Landscaping looked at my sketches with growing confusion. "So let me get this straight," he said, scratching his head. "You want to dig a 3-foot deep trench across the corner of your property and make it look like a creek bed." "It is not just a trench," I explained. "It is a decorative water feature and erosion control system that will enhance the property while managing rainwater runoff." Jeff was not convinced. "Look, buddy, I have been doing this for 20 years. People put these things along the back of properties or in garden features, not right at front corners where they interfere with normal foot traffic." I thanked him for his time and continued my search. The next 2 consultations ended similarly, with contractors hesitant to take on what they clearly perceived as an unusual and possibly problematic installation. My 4th attempt proved more successful. Maria Delgado of Natural Elements Landscaping listened to my explanation with growing interest rather than skepticism. "So this is about water management and aesthetic improvement," she said, examining my property corner. "Exactly," I replied, not mentioning Karen or the ongoing conflict. Maria walked the area, taking measurements and photos. "You know, this corner does have natural drainage issues. See how the water would collect here after heavy rain. A proper why design dry creek bed would actually improve drainage significantly." She paused, looking at me with a slight smile. "It would also be impossible to drive across without high-clearance 4-wheel drive." Our eyes met in silent understanding. Maria did not need to know my primary motivation, but she was experienced enough to recognize there was more to the story. She simply chose to focus on the legitimate benefits the installation would provide. Over the next week, Maria helped refine my initial concept into a professional design that would satisfy multiple purposes. The creek bed would vary in depth from 18 inches to nearly 3 feet at its deepest point. Large decorative boulders would be strategically placed, appearing random, but actually creating impassable barriers for vehicles. Native water-loving plants would line the edges, their root systems helping prevent erosion while adding visual appeal. Most importantly, every aspect of the design complied with HOA guidelines. In fact, the installation could be presented as an enhancement to the neighborhood, an environmentally friendly water management system that added natural beauty to the streetscape. With the design finalized, I needed permits and HOA approval. Maria helped prepare the necessary documentation, carefully emphasizing the drainage benefits and aesthetic improvements without mentioning the defensive aspects. The application described a naturalistic water feature and rain garden designed to manage storm runoff while enhancing neighborhood character. I submitted the paperwork to the city first, securing a standard landscaping permit without difficulty. The HOA application required board approval, which presented a potential obstacle given Karen's position. However, I had timed the submission strategically, knowing the board met the first Tuesday of each month and Karen had mentioned at the last meeting that she would be attending her sister's wedding in Colorado during the next session. Without Karen present, the remaining board members reviewed my thoroughly documented proposal. Michael, the treasurer I had spoken with earlier, actually expressed enthusiasm for the project, noting that it aligned with the neighborhood's recent push for more natural landscaping. The application was approved unanimously, with the official record showing it as a model environmental installation that other homeowners might consider emulating. With permits secured and materials ordered, all that remained was the installation. I scheduled the work for the following weekend, coincidentally when Karen was still scheduled to be out of town. The pieces were falling into place with a precision that felt almost like divine intervention. As I reviewed the final plan spread across my dining room table, I could not help but smile at the elegant solution I had found. Karen's shortcut was about to become the most beautifully impassable corner in the entire neighborhood. The Friday before construction was set to begin, I drove past Karen's house and confirmed her absence. The driveway was empty and window blinds were drawn. Perfect timing. I had arranged for all materials to be delivered early Saturday morning, and Maria's crew was scheduled to arrive at 7 sharp. I could barely sleep that night, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness keeping me awake until the early hours. Dawn broke with the rumble of a delivery truck backing into my driveway. I greeted the driver with coffee in hand, directing him to stack the river rocks and boulders along the side of my garage. By 6:30, my driveway resembled a quarry, piles of stones in various sizes, bags of special soil mix, drainage materials, and dozens of native plants in temporary containers. The scale of the project was more impressive in reality than it had appeared on paper. Maria arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by a crew of 4 workers. They unloaded equipment efficiently: shovels, wheelbarrows, levels, and a small excavator that would do most of the heavy digging. Maria walked me through the day's schedule one final time. "We will start with marking the boundaries and excavating the main channel," she explained. "That should take most of the morning. After lunch, we will install the drainage layers and position the larger stones. If all goes well, we should complete the hardscape elements today and save the planting for tomorrow." I nodded, unable to contain my excitement. "Do whatever you need to do. I will be around all day if you have any questions." By 8 o'clock, the project was fully underway. The excavator carved into my lawn with surprising precision, removing soil exactly where Karen's tire tracks had worn paths through the grass. Neighbors began to take notice, initially peering through windows, then gradually emerging from their homes to watch the transformation. I offered friendly waves but gave no detailed explanations, simply saying I was installing a water feeder to improve drainage and curb appeal. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was the first to approach directly. "My goodness," she said, watching the growing depression in my lawn. "That is quite the project you have there." "It is going to be a dry creek bed," I explained. "Great for managing rainwater, and it will look beautiful with all the native plants and stones." "How interesting," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "And in such a specific location, too." By midday, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. A steady stream of curious neighbors found reasons to walk past my house, each stopping to observe the progress. Some asked questions about the design, while others simply nodded with knowing smiles. No one mentioned Karen directly, but there was an unmistakable understanding in their expressions. Michael from the HOA board stopped by with his dog around 2 in the afternoon. "It is looking great," he commented, surveying the excavation. "Very defensive." I maintained an innocent expression, just trying to do my part for neighborhood beautification and proper water management. Michael chuckled. "Of course, the board is very supportive of such improvements." He lowered his voice. "Karen returns tomorrow evening. The timing is just unfortunate, I suppose." "Pure coincidence," I assured him, struggling to keep a straight face. By sunset, the basic structure of my moat was clearly visible. The excavation formed a graceful curve exactly matching the corner of my property, with varying depths that would make vehicle crossing impossible. Large boulders had been positioned at strategic points, appearing decorative while creating impassable barriers. The crew had installed drainage materials at the bottom to ensure water would properly filter through rather than stagnate. As Maria's team packed up for the day, she walked me around the installation, explaining the next day's work. "Tomorrow, we will add the river rocks to line the entire channel, install the bridge pathway here for foot access, and plant all the native species. By tomorrow evening, it will look like it has always been part of the landscape." I thanked her and her crew for their excellent work. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, I stood alone at the edge of my property, admiring the transformation. Even in this unfinished state, the project had a certain beauty, a raw potential that would soon become a finished masterpiece. More importantly, it was completely impassable by vehicle. Sunday's work proceeded as smoothly as Saturday's. The installation of smaller river rocks created a natural-looking streambed effect. Native grasses, flowering perennials, and small shrubs were planted along the edges and between rocks, their varied textures and colors creating visual interest. A small footbridge crossed the deepest section, providing access to the corner while enhancing the aesthetic appeal. Throughout the day, I installed discrete solar-powered landscape lighting that would illuminate the feature at night, highlighting key elements while also ensuring the moat would be visible after dark. These lights were carefully positioned to appear decorative while functioning as safety features, and not coincidentally, as additional cameras. Each light contained a small motion-activated security camera, providing multiple angles of coverage without being obvious surveillance. By Sunday evening, the transformation was complete. What had once been a vulnerable corner of lawn had become a stunning landscape feature that would be at home in a high-end garden magazine. The dry creek bed curved naturally along the property line, varying in width and depth, dotted with strategic boulders and lush native plants. It was beautiful, environmentally friendly, completely HOA compliant, and absolutely impossible to drive across. As Maria's crew loaded the last of their equipment, she handed me the maintenance instructions and warranty information. "It is one of our best installations," she said proudly. "The plants will need regular watering for the first month, but after that, they should be mostly self-sufficient." She paused, looking at my moat with satisfaction. And it should stand up to any kind of weather or traffic. I thanked her again for understanding my vision so perfectly. As the landscaping trucks pulled away, several neighbors gathered near my property, admiring the finished product. Their comments were enthusiastic and supportive, with several asking for Maria's contact information for their own projects. That night, I sat on my front porch with a glass of iced tea, admiring my creation in the gentle glow of the landscape lighting. The moat looked even more impressive after dark, the lights casting dramatic shadows and highlighting the natural textures of stone and plant. Everything was ready for tomorrow morning's inevitable confrontation. I had set my alarm for earlier than usual, determined not to miss Karen's furs. Encounter with my defensive masterpiece. Monday morning arrived with perfect clarity, clear skies, bright sunshine, and excellent visibility for my security cameras. I positioned myself at my kitchen window with coffee in hand, laptop open to the security feed, determined not to miss a moment of what was about to unfold. According to the patterns I had documented, Karen typically made her shortcut journey at 7:43 a.m., give or take 2 minutes. At precisely 7:41, her white Lexus SUV appeared at the far end of the street. I felt my heart rate increase as she approached, driving at her usual unhurried pace. She slowed slightly at the intersection, exactly where she would normally begin her turn onto my lawn. From my vantage point, I could see her expression change from casual disinterest to sudden confusion. Karen braked abruptly, her vehicle stopping halfway through her usual turn. She leaned forward in her seat, staring at the transformation before her. Where her familiar shortcut had once been, there now stood an impassable landscape feature, a beautiful but definitive barrier to her routine trespass. For several seconds, she remained motionless, apparently processing what she was seeing. Then she attempted to find another angle, inching her SUV forward and to the right, looking for any possible path across my property. There was none. The moat extended the entire length of the vulnerable corner, and the strategic placement of boulders blocked any potential crossing points. After nearly a minute of futile maneuvering, Karen's expression transformed from confusion to unmistakable anger. Her face flushed visibly even from my distance, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. With an abrupt motion, she reversed her vehicle, backed onto the proper roadway, and proceeded to follow the correct route around the corner, exactly as every other driver in the neighborhood had always done. I allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction, but I knew this was only the opening move in what would likely become a more significant confrontation. I was not disappointed. Exactly 23 minutes later, my doorbell camera activated, showing Karen standing on my front porch. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, her foot tapping impatiently on my welcome mat. I took a deep breath and opened the door with a neutral expression. "Good morning, Karen. What can I do for you?" "What is that thing on your lawn?" she demanded without preamble, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Oh, the new landscaping feature. It is a decorative dry creek bed and rain garden, environmentally friendly and fully approved by both the city and the HOA board." I maintained a pleasant, conversational tone. "I never approved any such installation," she snapped. "The board approved it unanimously last Tuesday," I explained calmly. "It was all properly documented. I believe you were out of town for your sister's wedding at the time." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That installation is hazardous and inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. It will need to be removed immediately." "I am afraid I cannot do that," I replied. "The installation is completely compliant with all HOA regulations. In fact, It was commended by the board as an example of environmentally conscious landscaping that other homeowners might want to emulate. "We will see about that," Karen said, her voice dropping dangerously. "I am calling an emergency HOA meeting for this evening, 7 p.m. at the community center. As the property owner in violation, your attendance is mandatory." Before I could respond, she turned and marched back to her vehicle. I closed my door slowly, allowing myself another small smile. The emergency meeting was exactly what I had anticipated, and precisely what I had prepared for. I spent the day organizing my evidence and preparing my presentation. By 6:30 that evening, I arrived at the community center with my laptop, a portable projector, and two neatly organized folders of documentation. I had dressed professionally in a button-down shirt and slacks, wanting to project an image of reasonable composure. The meeting room filled quickly. It seemed every homeowner in the neighborhood had received notice of the emergency session. Karen sat at the head table with the other board members, her expression severe as she called the meeting to order. "We are here to address a serious violation of neighborhood standards," she began, not bothering with usual formalities. "A hazardous and unapproved landscape installation at the corner property owned by our neighbor." She gestured toward me without using my name. "The installation creates a safety hazard, disrupts the visual cohesion of the neighborhood, and was installed without proper approval. As such, I move that we require immediate removal at the homeowner's expense, plus applicable fines for unauthorized modifications." Michael, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Point of order, Ka. Ren, the board did approve this installation last week. I have the signed documentation right here." Karen's expression flickered briefly. That approval was granted without full information and under unusual circumstances. Now that we can see the actual installation, it clearly violates our standards for appropriate landscaping. At this point, I raised my hand politely. Karen ignored me, continuing to list supposed violations, but Michael interrupted again. "I believe we should hear from the homeowner, since this meeting concerns their property." Karen paused, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, you have 5 minutes to explain yourself." I stood and connected my laptop to the projector. "Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to present some relevant context before discussing the landscape feature itself." The first image that appeared on the wall was a calendar marked with dates spanning the past 3 months. These highlighted dates represent documented instances of vehicle trespass across my property. I clicked to the next slide. The first clear security footage of Karen's SUV cutting across my lawn. A murmur ran through the room. Karen's face paled slightly. "Over the past 12 weeks, my property has sustained repeated damage from a vehicle using my lawn as a shortcut. This occurred approximately 5 times per week, causing permanent damage to the grass and soil structure." I advanced through several more images showing the deterioration of my lawn over time. I attempted to address this issue through direct communication. The next slides showed my email correspondence and documentation of my conversation with Karen. When that proved unsuccessful, I installed a small decorative fence, which was destroyed deliberately by the same vehicle. The security footage of Karen driving through my fence elicited audible gasps from several attendees. Karen's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. After consulting with legal counsel regarding my property rights, I chose to install a landscape feature that would both enhance the neighborhood aesthetically and protect my property from further damage. Every aspect of this installation complies with HOA regulations. I displayed the approved plans and permits. In conclusion, my actions were reasonable, measured responses to ongoing property damage. The installation is not only compliant with all regulations, but actually improves drainage, supports local wildlife with native plants, and enhances the overall aesthetic value of our neighborhood. I concluded my presentation and sat down, allowing the images of the before and after transformation to remain projected on the wall. The room had fallen completely silent. Every eye moved between the compelling evidence displayed and Karen's increasingly uncomfortable posture. After several seconds of awkward silence, Mrs. Henderson slowly raised her hand. When acknowledged by Michael rather than Karen, she stood. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 17 years," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "During that time, I have received 14 violation notices from our HOA president. 4 of them arrived the week after my sister's funeral when my lawn care service missed a visit." She looked directly at Karen. "I would like to state for the record that I find the new landscape feature beautiful and appropriate, and I object to any attempt to force its removal." Her statement seemed to break a dam of silence. Mr. Garcia raised his hand next. "My family has received citations for having too many cars in our driveway during our Sunday family gatherings. Meanwhile, I have personally witnessed the HOA president driving across private property repeatedly. This selective enforcement needs to stop." One by one, neighbors stood to share their experiences. The Wilson family described being fined for their son's basketball hoop. The Jeffersons recounted receiving violations for holiday decorations that were within size limits, but not to Karen's personal taste. Each story built upon the previous ones, creating a comprehensive picture of favoritism and petty tyranny. Throughout these testimonies, Karen sat rigidly in her chair, her expression moving from disbelief to anger to something approaching fear as she realized how quickly her support was evaporating. When she finally attempted to regain control of the meeting, her voice lacked its usual authority. "These accusations are completely irrelevant to the matter at hand," she insisted. "We are here to discuss a specific violation, not air personal grievances." Michael cleared his throat again. "Actually, Karen, I believe these statements are directly relevant to establishing a pattern of selective enforcement, which bears directly on this case." He turned to address the room. "I move that we put the matter to an immediate vote. All in favor of requiring removal of the landscape feature in question, please raise your hands." Not a sin. Glee hand went up, not even among the remaining board members. Karen's isolation was complete and visible to everyone present. "All in favor of allowing the installation to remain as an approved neighborhood improvement," Michael continued. Every hand in the room except Karen's shot into the air. The vote was decisive and overwhelming. "Motion to retain the installation passes unanimously among voting members," Michael announced. "This matter is considered resolved. Is there any other business to discuss this evening?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Karen gathering her papers and abruptly exiting the community center, the door closing firmly behind her. As the meeting officially adjourned, neighbors approached me with congratulations, questions about my landscaper's contact information, and more stories about their own experiences with Karen's reign. I had not just protected my property, I had inadvertently sparked a long overdue revolution in our neighborhood governance.